Hello, New Testament intro students. It's 10:39. I saw you all about 50 minutes ago, and now I'm going to tell you about 2nd Corinthians. Obviously, I don't have to go into the background of Corinth because it's the same city. The things you want to, specific things you want to note about any background stuff on 2 Corinthians, like I said, is that it's actually the 4th letter that Paul wrote. The third, with one exception, the 3rd letter that he refers to in the early part of 2 Corinthians, the harsh letter, the letter of tears, where he kind of ripped into them because he was angry over the conflict. There is some indication that that 3rd letter might actually be essentially chapters 10 through 12, or maybe 10 through 13. Because when you look at the flow of the argument that he makes in 2 Corinthians, 10 through 12 does seem a little odd. And I'll explain that as I kind of walk you through 2 Corinthians. So the thing I want to know about 2 Corinthians, the thing you want to know about 2 Corinthians is, he had written 1 Corinthians, answering their questions, confronting them on some stuff. Then some kind of conflict happened with certain Judaizers who Paul calls super apostles. That's how they presented themselves. These super apostles came to Corinth when Paul was away, and they kind of stirred up trouble for him, claiming that they have letters of recommendation, and Paul doesn't have letters of recommendation, so you shouldn't listen to him, you should listen to them. And when he got word of that, he came to Corinth unannounced, and there was kind of a big blow-up between him and the church, and he left really angry. That's when he wrote the harsh letter, letter number 3. But that letter actually had the effect of getting the Corinthian church to realize that they were wrong to start this feud with him, and they repented and they wanted to reconcile. And once he got word that they wanted to reconcile, that is when he writes 2 Corinthians, at least chapters 1 through 9. The bulk of 2 Corinthians is that letter he's writing upon hearing that they want to reconcile. And it's much more loving, much more conciliatory, and hopeful. Okay? So that's the situation. Now, as we walk through 2 Corinthians, just like in all of his letters, he has a general greeting at the beginning with a general blessing, thanksgiving. If you look closely at all his letters, he does that. The bulk of the actual letter itself really starts in chapter 1, verse 12. And I'll show this on Monday, like the visual map, so you can kind of get a visual of it. But basically, it breaks down like this. If you want to write this down, you can. It'll help. Sorry, getting a message there. Chapter 1, 12 to 2:4 is basically him giving a basic travel log, like where he was going, what he was wanting to do. It's kind of background information. So that's the first thing. The travel log, 1:12 to 2:17. I didn't mean 2:4. 2:17. 1:12 to 2:17. And this is basically what he says in that section. His plan was to swing by Corinth on his way to Macedonia, and then come back through Corinth as he makes his way to Judea with the collection for the saints, okay? That's the idea. He's in Ephesus. He wants to swing by Corinth, go visit the churches up in Macedonia, which would be Philippi and Thessalonica. And then after that, to come back through Corinth and then make his way to Judea. That's the plan. That's what he says in this travelogue, all right? Now, but unfortunately, because of the bad visit, things got screwed up, and now that they have given indication that they want to reconcile. He basically says at the end of this passage that he's ready to reconcile. Don't blame the man, meaning there is some specific person in the congregation who was kind of responsible for really bringing the division up. And so Paul says, let's just reconcile. Don't blame that guy. The real enemy is Satan, who is trying to divide us. Basically, that's what he says. Now, interesting thing about 2 Corinthians, there's a lot of specific verses that are very well known that once you understand how they fit into the context of the letter, they make even more sense. In 2:12 through 17, he talks about, let me see this here. Let me read it for you. 2 Corinthians 2. As he's talking about wanting to reconcile, he basically says, I'll just read you 2:12 to 17. Now when I came to Troas for the gospel of Christ, the door was open for me in the Lord, but since I did not have relief in my spirit, because I did not find my brother Titus there, I said goodbye to them and went out to Macedonia. But grace be to God, who is always leading us in triumphant procession in Christ, and making known the fragrance of his knowledge through us in every place. For we are the fragrant aroma of Christ for God, to those who are being saved, and to those who are being destroyed. To some we are a fragrance from death to death, but to others we are fragrance from life to life. What the heck is he talking about? It is a metaphor. He's referring to the triumphal processions that would happen in Rome. After there would be a great victory, or a military victory, they would have a triumph parade in Rome, and where the general would come with all the stuff he had taken, and leading the parade would be a collection of the prisoners, and they would parade them through the streets of Rome. They would take them to the temple of Jupiter, and they would ceremonially sacrifice and kill these prisoners before the temple of Jupiter. Now, along with that triumphal parade, all throughout Rome for that parade, there would be incense burning as they got closer to the temple. So therefore, the fragrant aroma, that's what Paul is referencing. So basically, on one hand, Paul is saying, so when you realize that's the background, when Paul is saying we, apostles, are being led in triumphal procession, it's kind of weird because in his scenario, Christ is the victor, and Paul the apostle is like the prisoner going ready to get sacrificed. Doesn't sound too good, but that's a good thing because Paul sees sacrificing your life just like Christ sacrificed his life as bringing salvation, bring furthering of the gospel. So on one hand, Paul says he's the one being led in triumphal procession, meaning he's kind of like a prisoner servant of Christ. But then he switches and then he says we're also the aroma, the incense. And for those destined for death, it's the smell of death, meaning people are about to be killed. But in Paul, he's basically talking about the pagans and the Jews who reject him. They're going to be destroyed, and therefore the gospel for them is like this fragrance that is repulsive because it emphasizes that they're wrong and they'll suffer. By contrast, those who are celebrating in the victory, when they smell the incense, it's the incense of victory in life. So he's using that metaphor of being led in triumph in Christ that way. All right. With that, in the next section from basically chapter 3, verse 1 to 5:10 is another section where he emphasizes his role as a minister in the new covenant. Okay? And this is where he addresses what these super apostles were claiming. Basically, this is where we find out that the super apostles were claiming that Paul was a fraud because the super apostles had letters of recommendation and Paul didn't have letters of recommendation. Paul responds to that by saying, well, you, the church in Corinth, are my letter of recommendation written by the Spirit. Okay? Now, what that means, that goes to the heart of the tension between Judaism and Christianity at the time. The Judaizers, the super apostles, were wanting the Gentiles to submit to the Torah that was, written in stone. But in the Old Testament itself, particularly in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 33, Jeremiah prophesies that after the exile, this is Old Testament time, that God would make a new covenant with his people in which the Torah would be written on their hearts. That would be implied by God's Spirit, meaning they would be able to really be fulfilled. The problem with the Mosaic covenant is that it was written on tablets, but it really hadn't penetrated to the heart of the people. That's why they broke it. So Paul, by saying that the church in Corinth is his letter of recommendation written by the Spirit, he's emphasizing that the very existence of the Gentile Christian church in Corinth is evidence that God's Spirit has been writing the Torah on people's hearts and that this new covenant has come. Unlike what the super apostles were trying to do. Okay? He also, sticking with the Torah Sinai covenant, new covenant contrast, he then talks about how the super apostles are engaged in the ministry of death, and Paul in his new covenant is engaged in a ministry of the Spirit. The ministry of death is a reference to the Old Covenant and the Torah, because it's not because the Torah is bad, but it's because if you are under the Torah, you don't keep Torah, and therefore, as a punishment for not keeping Torah, you die. So what the super apostles were trying to get the Corinthian church to do is to submit to the Torah, but that's dealing with a ministry of death. So that's another thing he mentions. He then mentions the story in the Exodus about how when Moses went up the mountain of Mount Sinai, when he came back down, he wore a veil over his face for a while because his face was glowing with God's glory, and he wore a veil to prevent the people from looking at it. And Paul takes that image and he says, that veil, with the coming of Christ in the new covenant, that veil has been removed, and we Christians can now behold God's glory in full. By contrast, when the super apostles and the Judaizers still come together for the reading of the Torah, that veil is still over their hearts, and they don't get that the whole point of the Torah was to point the way to Christ. So he's again contrasting the super apostle Judaizing Old Covenant with the gospel New Covenant. Okay? He then uses the metaphor in chapter 4 that we are like treasure in clay vessels, which kind of makes sense because the clay vessels are mortal bodies. They will be broken, but the treasure is the salvation we've already have, and that eventually, even though we die, that treasure will then come to life in our new bodies, so to speak. He then uses another metaphor in chapter 5, equating the tabernacle in the wilderness with the old covenant and the eternal house in heaven waiting for Christians with the new covenant. That eternal house is going to be the temple of God. Now here's where he's going to get into this a little later, but I'll say it now. I can't remember where it is. Hold on. Yeah. He's going to get into a chapter 6, so I'll hold off on that. But that's another contrast. The Old Covenant, super apostle Judaizers, they're like the tabernacle in the wilderness, but that's not where you want to stay. You want to get to the promised land, the new creation, heaven, and go to our eternal house, which is he's going to talk about is the temple of God. Okay, so that's the new covenant. Once he lays that out, this third chunk is in 5:11 to 7:16. And this is all about the importance of reconciliation. He basically says, because Christ died for others, and because we died in Christ, we then, because we experience the Spirit, the resurrection life already, is we then live our lives for others, hoping to reconcile them to God. We've died to the old way of life. Now, even though we're still living in the old age, we are living with the purpose to bring reconciliation. That's what he says. And then he talks about in chapter 6, 1 through 10, Therefore, the day of salvation is now, so take it. Now, he's not talking about, get converted, because he's talking to people who are already Christians. He's equating the day of salvation with their attempt at reconciliation. Every reconciliation, salvation is more realized. That's kind of what he's saying. So he then encourages them to take hold of it and reconcile. Then he talks about, in 6:11 to the end of the chapter, another famous verse about don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. I don't know about you, but growing up, I was always told that verse was about don't marry a non-Christian. Again, as basic advice, that might be a good bit of advice, but he's not talking about that. He's talking about the yoke is oftentimes in Judaism and in the Gospels, when Jesus says, take my yoke upon you, for I'm meek and humble of heart. He's talking about teaching. So he says, don't be unequally yoked. He's basically saying, stay with the teaching of the gospel, the yoke of Christ. Don't put on the yoke of the super apostles and the Judaizers and Torah observance. Don't be unequally yoked. That's what he's talking about. Because then, from there, because you don't want to be unequally yoked, he brings it back to the idea that he tells the church in Corinth, you, the community church in Corinth, you are the temple of the living God in Corinth. And this is really significant because that's a statement to contrast this Christian community with the 26 other pagan temples in Corinth. So by saying that, he's saying, don't have anything to do with those pagan temples in Corinth. You yourself are the temple of the living God. And that also contrasts it with Old Covenant Judaism, which is centered on the Torah and the temple in Jerusalem. Don't be unequally yoked because you don't have anything to do with those. You yourself are the living temple of God in Corinth. Okay? And then he mentions at the end of chapter 7 that he's overjoyed that they're going to be reconciled. All right. Once that's out of the way, in chapters 8 and 9, he gets to the business of the collection. And the collection, when you read it, is really kind of humorous. Because, like I said in class today, Paul's motivation for taking up a collection from his Gentile churches is so he can take it to Jerusalem to help the Jews and the Jewish Christians who are hurting in Jerusalem, hoping that by doing that he would be able to bring people together. Okay? Now, when you read chapter 8, and you read it closely, he's really kind of pressuring them to give, but he doesn't want to seem like he's pressuring them to give, but he really wants them to give. When you read it closely, it's really funny. He's saying, because he's in Macedonia right now, and he's saying, I want to give you time to take up your collection because I've been bragging about how generous all you guys are. You don't want to let me down, do you? Because then we would both look really foolish. Right there's a pressure for them to give for their collection. And then he says, I'm not going to come right back to Corinth right now, because if I come right now with the people up here in Macedonia, with the Christians up in Macedonia, if we come right now and you don't have your gift ready, then it won't look good. And then even if later on you do get your gift together, then it's going to look like I pressured you, and I'm not pressuring you. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to send Titus first, and he'll work with you to make up a collection, and you'll have it all ready to go. So then when I come, you'll have it all ready to go, and everybody will be happy. So it's really kind of a interesting couple chapters when he talks about taking up the collection for Jerusalem. Now, that would seem like that would be a logical ending to the letter. He's happy they're reconciling. He says his stuff. Okay, now let's get to the business of taking up the collection. But then you have chapters 10 through 12. And all of a sudden, chapters 10 through 12, it's this long defense of his ministry against the super apostle. He goes back to that, which is kind of weird. That is why a lot of scholars tend to think maybe 10 through 12 is actually that third letter that was really harsh. Because when you read 10 through 12, it seems pretty harsh, and it doesn't seem to fit at this point in the letter. So I tend to agree that it might be that third letter. But anyway, let's find out what he says. Really simple. In 10 through 12, he defends his ministry again. He says, even though we apostles, we are still walking in the flesh, we are not walking according to the flesh. What that means, when Paul uses the word flesh, he's not necessarily using just physicality here. He's talking about this, what he would call the old age, natural, corrupted, created order. Okay? That's going to die and corrupt. We're still living in the old age, but we're not living according to the rules of the old age. That makes sense? So he defends his ministry. He says that. He basically says, one of the surefire ways you know that you're living according to the flesh is if there's divisions going on. You know you're living according to the Spirit when reconciliation is going on. That's his point. Then, in chapter 11 and 12, he really lets these super apostles have it. And he basically says, we are different. Yeah, they have a letter of recommendation. We already talked about that. But I am an apostle of the gospel, and I make sure that I don't take money from you to support me. That's why I work as a tent maker when I was with you. I didn't want you to pay my way because I didn't want anything to get in the way of the gospel. These super apostles, on the other hand, when they came to you, they were expecting you to pay them. They're shysters. That's basically what he's saying. So that's one difference between him and the super apostles. They want you to pay their way. I refuse to let you to pay my way because I didn't want to have a hindrance to the gospel. He then says, these super apostles keep bragging about their Jewish street cred, and he says, I could do that too. I'm a Jew, I was circumcised, I was Torah. Goes into all his Jewish credentials. But he says, those aren't worth much in terms of righteousness. I ought to know. So he basically says, on the Jewish credential stuff, we're equal. But he says, I could brag about even more stuff. And he goes into bragging about all of his tribulations and his sufferings. He says, I actually have suffered for the gospel. They haven't. Okay? So that's one thing. And then, and the funny thing is, the way he does this is he kind of attacks them first for bragging about themselves. But then he kind of has to brag about himself to contrast with them. That's why he brings up his own Jewish credentials. Then he says, I'll brag about my sufferings. They can't do that. And then in chapter 12, he then brags about the visions and revelations he's had, some kind of visions and revelations he's had. But he doesn't even say it's him. He says, I'm going to talk to you about a guy who was caught up into, I think, the third heaven. He's talking about himself, to be clear. But he doesn't put himself as talking about himself because it would be improper for him to just completely brag about himself, but he wants to bring it up about himself. So he says, basically, another thing I can brag about is I've had these visions and revelations. That's when he then talks about his thorn in the flesh. He says that God gave me this thorn in the flesh to keep me humble, because heck, if you've had a vision and revelation from God, you can get kind of arrogant. And therefore he got this thorn in the flesh to keep him humble. There's speculation as to what that means, what it was, his thorn in the flesh. I tend to think it was probably had something to do with his bad eyesight, as we've talked about before. When he had the Damascus Road experience, he was blind for 3 days, then scales fell off his eyes. He could see again, but there's indication, like in Galatians, that he might not have had good eyesight, and that would have been a bummer. So he talks about that, and his whole point is the things that I'm really going to brag about, that I'm going to boast in, aren't my Jewish credentials. It's going to be my suffering and my weakness, because it's in the suffering and weakness that salvation comes. When you really think about it, that's kind of the purpose of the whole story of the cross. And so that's what he talks about. Chapter 13, he just does some final warnings and greetings, and that's that. Okay, so I walked you through 2 Corinthians. What I would like you to do, obviously, over the weekend, obviously get you the homework done, but then take time, if you haven't already, just given what we've covered in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, just take time to read through them and just to follow along what Paul is saying, given what I've talked to you about, and see if you understand it. And Then on Monday, I'll entertain any questions you might have, and then we'll kind of give some overview of what to expect on the midterm. Okay. Have a lovely weekend.